Slavery, Christianity, and the Black Exodus from the Church. The enslavement of natives began in the Western world shortly after Columbus and his Spanish conquistadors crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed in the Caribbean. The form of government, which became known as colonialism, was utilized by the Spanish invaders who took over the natives' lands. One of their first leaders, Hernan Cortez, enforced Spanish rulership over the natives to help enrich himself, Spain, and the Catholic Church. With the help of Spanish missionaries, the Spanish conquerors or conquistadors took over the island, which they named after their saint, Dominic, and proceeded to beat, torture, mutilate, and murder thousands of natives to get more gold. They also used these natives to work on plantations to feed the colonists and to sell their produce to Europe and elsewhere. Everyone was not pleased with the enslavement of natives. One conquistador by the name of Bartolome de las Casas, who later became a Catholic monk, spoke out against the inhumane treatment of the natives. He wrote to Pope Alexander VI and even traveled back to Europe to debate a Catholic scholar who supported the barbaric treatment of the natives. The Pope listened to the opposing sides regarding the enslavement of the natives, but eventually sided with the Catholic scholar and those who supported this very lucrative enterprise. Bartolome de las Casas decided, although he later regretted his decision, to use Africans as slaves instead of the Aboriginal native Indians. So after the Spaniards had almost killed off the population of natives, they continued to stay in business since they had a continent of Africans that they could use instead. Portugal, France, and even Britain got into the slave business and made use of the Africans. The argument often used to justify slavery by European colonists was that slavery was in the Bible. They stated that it had been instituted by God after he cursed Adam's son Cain with black skin. Europeans also used the excuse that Jews had slaves and that even the Africans and Arabs had slaves. Europeans indicated that their form of slavery was justified because it helped convert the uncivilized Africans to Christianity. Because some people became slaves after being prisoners of war or to pay off a debt as indentured servants in the Bible, Europeans used this as their excuse to justify their enslavement of Africans. What Europeans often failed to realize or admit was that many Africans were not prisoners of a justified war, but free persons kidnapped and forced into slavery unjustly. They also failed to realize that in older forms of slavery, the slaves had the opportunity to become free persons and gain equal status with their former master. Europeans viewed slaves as their permanent property, not humans with intelligence or individuals which had the right to be free, just as their European captors. Another excuse to use Africans as slaves was that Europeans supposedly could not handle the field work in the sun like African slaves, and since Africans had black skin, they were more suited for this work. Some white Christians realized the error of their Christian brothers and sisters who supported slavery. These brave souls who opposed slavery became known as abolitionists. Most Christian churches rejected the abolitionist message as devilish and disruptive to the peaceful coexistence of masters and slaves that existed before these troublemaker abolitionists started stirring things up. Unfortunately, a white Christian group whose members became known as Quakers also began to oppose slavery. The abolitionists were joined by a former slave named Frederick Douglass, who became a strong testament against the lies that the slave owners had used to justify slavery. The slave owners claimed slaves were not intelligent, couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't speak well, and couldn't do well outside of slavery. Frederick Douglass proved them wrong, although many couldn't bring themselves to believe it. He could read, he wrote his own books, he spoke well, and took care of himself and his wife without being a slave. Other Africans in the United States and in Europe, such as Sarah Forbes Bonita, prove that pro-slavery proponents' lies to be wrong. Further proof that Africans were intelligent and not the happy or content servants of Europeans that whites had claimed them to be came when the African slaves in Haiti rebelled against the French colonial rule. Under the leadership of an African from Haiti named Toussaint Louverture, the Africans vanquished the elite French army that was under Napoleon Bonaparte. Not wishing to accept defeat from African slaves, the French set out again to reclaim their colony from the Haitians, only to be beaten again by Haiti's African forces and malaria. After this, Thomas Jefferson and others sought to maintain an even stronger hold on slaves in the U.S. for fear that the slaves in the U.S. would try and possibly succeed in taking over the United States. Boston, which was known to some as the cradle of American democracy, was profiting from trade with the French colony of Haiti. But due to various problems with the French government's embargo on Haitian exports, Haitian trade with the United States was adversely affected. The Haitians' successful rebellion was an embarrassment to the French government under Napoleon. The island of Haiti was the first of many European colonies in the Americas to be overthrown by those who had been oppressed. Haiti's successful revolution was proof on an international scale that Africans had potential beyond what they had been given credit for officially by those who sought to justify their villainy against Africans. Another assault to the racist, slaveholding American colonists came from a criticism by the renowned 19th century British writer Charles Dickens. His criticism was not well received by slave owners and pro-slavery white ministers such as Orville Dewey. If that wasn't bad enough, the racist argument against African American intelligence received another embarrassing assault. In 1895, W.E.B. Du Bois, an African American, received his PhD from Harvard University. The racist lie about African American intelligence was countered again in the 19th century by an African American writer, orator, and educator named Booker T. Washington. Aside from these two African American scholars, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and others added their voices and energy to the efforts to free the minds and bodies of African Americans in the 19th century. And although criticized for not speaking openly against racism and injustice, the early African American poet Phillis Wheatley also showed George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Americans that blacks were intelligent and could communicate their thoughts in the same way as whites. Her efforts did not, however, immediately cause Washington and Jefferson to give up their slaves or give African Americans equal rights. The fight for civil rights came about largely due to the efforts of African Americans in the 20th century. There were many individuals who lent their voices and energy to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. One of the most well-known was a young African American born in the South named Martin Luther King Jr. King's life, like that of the human rights activist and former national spokesman for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, was cut short by an assassin. Although white racists hated King, they recognized him as a pacifist and felt pretty sure that he would not unleash a nationwide physical revolt against whites. But whites feared Malcolm X because his message was not one of pacifism, but retaliation. Although Martin and Malcolm both wanted justice, they sought a different means of getting it. King felt that integration was the best approach initially. Malcolm, on the other hand, felt that separation from whites and self-reliance was the correct path to take. Then there was the dynamic firebrand in and out of the professional boxing ring, Muhammad Ali. He also became an outspoken critic of the United States after he joined one of the many radical African American religious organizations that sprang up in the U.S. during the 20th century. So while Dr. King was attracting Christians, black and white, along with Jews to his cause, Malcolm X was attracting the attention of blacks who felt that they needed something more than pacifism and Christianity to help them achieve their goals in the world. African Americans had started to embrace alternative ideologies, but were still divided on how to accomplish this goal. For some young African Americans, the Black Panther Party seemed to be the answer. Others joined one of the various Black Hebrew religious organizations. After coming back from Mecca, Malcolm began talking about organizing a group that would put aside differences between blacks so that they could work together. But alternative ideologies did not begin with Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, or the Nation of Islam. Although not commonly known, African Americans had started moving away from Christianity 3 decades after the American Civil War. One of the first alternative African American religious organizations that began attracting blacks in the late 19th century was a black group claiming descent from Hebrews. More radical religious groups began to pop up in the 20th century. Some of these groups believe in using the Bible. However, there are others which have rejected Christianity and the Bible and have opted for the Quran and the religion of Islam. Although some alternative religious organizations have not incited violence, other groups, such as MOVE, were considered too dangerous and were violently attacked by the authorities. Segregation took the place of slavery, and many blacks felt that they were at a loss without anyone to assist or represent them. With the loss of black leadership and a lack of opportunities in African American communities, many young African Americans decided that to survive and thrive, their best option was to take over the streets by joining street gangs. Although the South had officially agreed to change its laws against blacks, had separate but equal facilities in schools, offices, and elsewhere, African Americans felt everything except equal. But the inequality and injustice faced by Africans did not begin in America or the Caribbean. It began in the motherland of Africa during tribal warfare, then continued with the African and Arab slave trade in Africa and the Middle East. And although Christianity was used to help perpetuate racial bias and enslavement of Africans, the religion advocated by Europeans was not the same as that which was advocated by the young rabbi which the world now calls Jesus. And the arguments proposed by those supporting African enslavement are, for the most part, not from the Bible. The following words from this point on will deal with two issues: contradictions regarding slaves and slavery, Christianity, slavery, and racism. Contradictions regarding slaves and slavery from racist opinions. Lie number 1, slaves need their masters. Lie number 2, slaves enjoyed being slaves. Lie number 3, female slaves crave sex with their white masters. Lie number 4, black men prefer white women. Lie number 5, slaves were lazy and stupid. Lie number 6, slaves couldn't organize and defend themselves against attacks. Lie number 7, slaves could not learn to read. Lie number 8, slaves had no original ideas. Lie number 9, slaves were subhuman. Lie number 10, slavery was better than earning wages in factories, etc. Lie number 11, slaves were barbarians and needed to be converted. Lie number 12, slavery in Christianity is justified. Lie number 13, slaves were colored due to sin. Lie number 14, slaves need to remain slaves for their own benefit. Lie number 15, slavery is part of the natural order of things and must be maintained. Lie number 16, slaves are docile and uncivilized. Lie number 17, slaves are not trustworthy. Lie number 18, slaves are not good for anything but singing and dancing. These racist statements and beliefs were perpetuated during slavery days. Unfortunately, some people may still hold to these beliefs despite evidence that is to the contrary. Christianity, slavery, and racism. Facts to consider. Fact number 1. Slavery is now over 2,000 years old. Fact number 2. It has its critics and proponents. Fact number 3. The faith was started by Jews. Fact number 4. It is based on Judaism. Fact number 5. An assessment of this religion should be based on its founder. Fact number 6. The apostles of Christ followed him. Fact number 7, Judaism's creation was credited to Abraham and Moses. Fact number 8, their mistakes were recorded in the Bible. Fact number 9, but the racism and enslavement of blacks for 2 to 4 centuries is not a mistake, but an intentional act. And fact number 10, many claiming to be Christian continue to promote it despite being shown its errors. Fact number 11, European enslavement of Africans involved gross negligence and barbaric subjugation for Europeans' self-centered ambitions not found in Christ or his apostles' teachings. Fact number 12. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and Muslims promoted slavery and racism. Fact number 13. Christianity today does not officially support racism, but it still exists. And fact number 14. There is still a need to address slavery in the world. The preceding information provided was based on research from the thesis project entitled Slavery, Christianity, and the Exodus from the Black Church by Paul E. Hunter.